All right, so the next thing that I want to take a look at here is a rather insidious problem that you may have noticed already. Now, in order to demonstrate this problem, we're going to create a new note and share it with this same other user here, and then we're going to be on separate notes and edit those notes. So perhaps that gives you a hint into what this problem is. But first, before we add a new note here, I noticed that there's one error that was somehow left over from before. And basically what we're going to have to do is inside format shared note, we're going to have to make sure that this shared with property exists first, because inside our create note route, we're not actually adding that property. So you could fix this problem by just adding shared with and having an empty array there. Or you could change it by just checking to see if shared with exists by saying note.sharedWith and note.sharedWith.find, okay? So either one, or better yet, just do both, right? That'll kind of create a fail-safe there. So that should be all we need to do. Our service should be running now, and let's go back here and create a new note. So we're gonna enter our title here. We'll just call this another note and click on create. And then we'll click on this note, and that should bring up the title and content for this note. So let's share this note now with our other user here. I'm just going to copy this email address, go into sharing settings, and add edit permission for this user to this note. And let's click on share now. All right, so we've given edit permissions to this other person here. So let's go back, and we're going to have to refresh the page here in order to see that. And by the way, that's something we can improve with WebSockets as well, right? Making notes automatically show up when they're shared with a user instead of having to refresh the page to see them. But we'll get to that later on. Don't worry too much about that now. All right, so in order to see the problem with our current setup, let's click on this another note here. And inside our other browser, let's go to hello other Sean, right? Whatever our other note that isn't this one is called. When we go to edit our note, we'll see that the title and content inside this other note, right, the note that is not the same as this one, are going to change to be the title and content of this note that we're editing over here. Now, the reason for this is because with our current setup on our server, we're not differentiating between which note a user is actually editing when this update note thing occurs. In other words, when an update note event occurs, we are updating the correct note, right? But we're notifying all of the users that are currently connected via WebSockets of these updates. Now, what we're going to have to do is somehow separate our users depending on which note they're updating, right? So in other words, if user 1 over here, all right, this is just going to be user 1. If user 1 is editing note number 1 and user 2 is editing note number 2, there should be sort of a divide between those that doesn't allow user 2's changes to make it into user 1's changes. Okay, and this is especially important because we want to make sure that users can't access notes that they shouldn't have access to, which is another thing that we're going to have to tighten up with our sockets here as well. But for now, let's just make sure that changes are organized according to note. And the way we're going to do this is using something called rooms in Socket.io. Basically, a room, you can think of it as sort of a chat room, right? It's a built-in feature that Socket.io provides that allows us to take a user who is just connected via a WebSocket and put them into one of several different rooms, right? We can choose the names for those rooms. We can choose, what users are in those rooms. So essentially, when a user connects to our server, right, when we get this connection event up here, we're going to put them into rooms based on what note they're editing. So all we're going to do is just use the ID of the note to identify the room. Right, so this will be room A, B, C, blah, 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 whatever the note's ID is. This might be room D, E, F, blah, blah, blah. Again, whatever the note's ID is, and so on and so forth. Right? Now, what rooms allow us to do is when an event occurs, right, when some kind of client triggers an event, we can emit that event only to sockets in a specific room. So this is exactly what we need in order to make our note sharing app work correctly with WebSockets and not have that weird behavior we were seeing earlier. All right, so the first thing that we're going to have to do here in order to add rooms to our server is we're going to need to add the socket to a room whenever a new socket joins. Now, again, we're just going to be using the ID of the note that the user is trying to edit as the room ID. And the way that we add sockets to rooms is by saying socket.join with the name of the room inside of these parentheses here. Now, we're actually going to want to do this probably down here after we load the note and everything, right above where we emit the initial note data. So what we're going to do is say socket.join, and we're going to use the note ID as the room name there. Okay, so at this point, the socket is part of a room, but in order to make sure that events from that room stay in that room, what we're going to need to do is go down to where we're saying io.sockets.sockets.forEach, and we're going to have to change this so that instead of getting all of the sockets that are currently connected to our server, regardless of the room, and sending this event to all of them, we're going to have to only get the sockets from a specific room. Now, this is actually way trickier than I thought it would be when I was first figuring out the code for this. So I'll just walk you through it. The first thing we have to do is we have to get all of the socket IDs from the room. For some reason or other, socket.io only lets us get the IDs from a specific room, whatever. So the way we do that is by saying const socket IDs equals await io.in, and then the room name here, which is going to be the note ID, and then we're going to say .all sockets. Okay, so at this point we have all of the socket IDs that are in that room. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to loop through those socket IDs by saying socket IDs.forEach. And then for each ID, what we're going to do is get the corresponding socket. Now, the way we do this is by saying const target socket, oops, there we go, equals io.sockets.sockets, yes, two sockets again, and then we say .get ID. Now, again, this is kind of a weird way that we have to go about this. I'm not a huge fan, but that's just how we do it. So at this point, we have the target socket for this ID, and that should allow us to do what we just did down here and say target socket.emit, blah, 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 blah. All right, so let's give this a try now. What we're going to do is go back to our application, and just to make sure that these are both connected correctly, let's just refresh the page. And when we click on edit now, what we're going to see is that those updates should immediately show up on this other user's screen. So we'll say, I am Sean test 2. Okay, and when we click done editing, this other one should be able to edit as well. And say, hi, I'm Sean test 1. And click done editing, and we see that all that stuff shows up over here as well. Cool, and just to make sure that this is all working as we want it to, let's try taking a look at another note. So we'll look at another note, and when we edit this one here, we should see that none of those changes show up on our other note here. And likewise, if we make changes to this one, none of those changes are going to show up over on this side. Cool, so we've separated out our application into rooms, which makes it so that different users can be working on different notes at the same time without having to worry about their updates conflicting, which obviously, you know, is just a basic piece of functionality in apps like this. So anyway, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.